I'm the storyteller, and my stories must be told. I have many stories, tales for both the young and old. I have many voices to describe many places. Many names have I, and many faces. In Russia I am Ivan, in Sweden I am Jan. In Germany I'm Johann, in America I'm John. From my many travels I have gathered these tales to teach you good sense when all else fails. Sometimes there are tears, sometimes there is laughter, but always are happily ever after.
Long ago and far away, there once lived a rich man in a very fine house. He was the squire in those parts, and he would boast to all his guests that as far as the eye could see, all the land belonged to him. He would point out the prosperous-looking villages, the fine buildings, the lush fields and farms, and everyone was most impressed. For this squire was very rich indeed. All his life had been spent accumulating wealth, and now that he was an old man, it had got to the stage where he could barely count all his gold coins. This was his favourite occupation. Each day he would make fresh entries in his account books. Mothers grew tired of introducing him to their pretty daughters, for he took no notice of them, even the prettiest. All he thought about was his fine house and lands, and how many gold coins were safely hidden away in his money chest. Now one day, he had arranged for the local cobbler's daughter, a clever young girl called Gretel, to come and do some cleaning at his house. The cobbler was a poor man who owed the squire a great deal of money. As he was very behindhand in his rent, he earnestly instructed Gretel to be extremely polite to the squire. She should always curtsy when he spoke to her, and work very hard for him. Because Gretel loved her father, she promised to obey him faithfully, although she, like everyone else, knew what a mean old man the squire really was. So the next day she presented herself at the squire's fine house, ready to do whatever was demanded of her. All day she scrubbed and she rubbed. All day she polished and shone. For such a fine building it was certainly very dirty, and Gretel found her work quite cut out for her. The squire was most impressed by her hard work. The silver now shone so brightly he could see his reflection in it, and he strutted from piece to piece, admiring himself in the shining surface. Gretel watched him preening and couldn't help smiling to herself. But as she busily polished and cleaned, the squire at last turned round and had a good look at Gretel herself. He thought she looked more beautiful than any of his lovely possessions. He strutted over to where Gretel knelt, scrubbing the floor. He tapped his foot impatiently until she couldn't ignore him any longer. "What an industrious young girl you are!" he exclaimed. "I should like you to marry me so you can always look after my house like this." "No, thank you, squire," laughed Gretel. and carried on working without a pause. Although the squire insisted, she simply refused. Now, he wasn't a man to be put off so easily, and he had yet to come across anyone who had said no to him as firmly as Gretel had. He tried giving her all sorts of gifts to win her heart. He gave her flowers, he gave her sweetmeats, finally, he even gave her some jewellery, but to no avail. He decided that drastic action was needed, so one day he paid a call on the cobbler. How fine he looked strutting down the village street with his footman in attendance. He caused quite a stir, and needless to say, when he banged imperiously on the cobbler's door, the poor man was most alarmed to have such an exalted visitor. Anxiously, he led the rich man into his tiny parlour. "Your daughter has refused to marry me, although I have asked her more than once. Now, I insist you command her to marry me," the squire declared angrily. "Well, Gretel knows her own mind, Your Honour," the cobbler began, rather nervously. "If she refuses you, what can I do?" "What can you do?" boomed the squire. "What about the rent you owe me? Do you know how many months you're in arrears? If Gretel marries me, I shall forget this debt and give you the freehold of this house." Well, that was a different matter, and the cobbler promised to do his best to persuade his obstinate daughter to change her mind. The two men parted the best of friends. However, when the cobbler thought the matter over, he realised he had taken on no easy task. He tried to explain to Gretel what a wonderful life she would lead as the squire's wife. "Just think how rich you would be," he urged. "Just think of the beautiful gowns you would own. You wouldn't have to work any longer, but just spend your days counting all your money. I know the squire's a bit long in the tooth, but after all, he is the richest man in the country. You would lack for nothing. Just think of the wonderful life you would lead." Strangely enough, the idea of such luxury with such a husband just didn't appeal to her. What with the squire's constant demands and Gretel's adamant refusals, the poor cobbler thought he would go mad. He lay awake night after night, dreaming up schemes of making Gretel marry the squire. He thought up all kinds of impossible ideas, until one night he knew he had it. Very early the next morning, he rushed over to the squire's grand house, full of glee to tell the rich man his marvellous plan. He happily told the squire to go ahead with his wedding preparations. The squire didn't need to be told twice. Invitations were sent far and wide to all the best people, bidding them to come to the squire's impending nuptials. Of course, this caused a great deal of gossip and speculation as to who the lucky girl was. No one knew, but everyone was agog with curiosity. At the squire's mansion, the kitchen was a hive of activity as the servants brewed and baked, cooked and cleaned for the wonderful feast planned to celebrate the happy event. What delicious food was prepared, while the wedding cake was almost a work of art. Never before had the squire spent money so freely. Of course, the squire, as the bridegroom, needed to be the best-dressed man there, and he ordered a gorgeous suit from the most fashionable tailor, just so that people could see what a handsome husband Gretel was marrying. The whole house was cleaned from ceiling to cellar to receive the squire's bride. At last, everything was ready. The happy day dawned, and the guests began arriving from near and far. Everyone was dressed in their very best clothes, but the finest was undoubtedly the squire, happily greeting his guests with the parson by his side. More and more guests arrived, and the squire was delighted that so many people would be able to see what a beautiful girl he was marrying. The guests certainly didn't need any urging to get started on the lavish food and drink offered. It was a long time since the squire had put on such a spread, and they reckoned it would be a long time before he did it again. They were staggered, and everyone wondered with rising curiosity who on earth the mysterious bride could be. Strangely enough, though, Gretel was just carrying on with her normal work at home, helping her father in the shop. She seemed quite unaware she was to be married that day. Now, when all the squire's guests had arrived, and the parson began to tap his foot impatiently, the squire ordered a young page to run off to Gretel's father and have him send up what he had promised. The parson, who had gone without breakfast and lunch, and who couldn't understand why there was such a delay, was very hungry. The squire had to assure him that all was well, and the bride would soon be arriving, and that then the wedding feast would begin. The young lad ran as fast as his legs could carry him to the cobbler's shop, and blurted out, "The master wants what you've promised, this very minute, because he's hopping mad," all in one breath. "Where's the rush?" the cobbler laughed. "She's down by the stream. Just go and collect her." So the page ran down to the stream where Gretel was doing the laundry. "I'm to fetch what your father promised the squire," he told her. "Ho-ho," thought Gretel, who was as clever as she was pretty. "You'll have to wake up earlier to fool me, squire." But aloud, she told the page that the squire wanted the little pony tethered by the barn, and calmly carried on washing to hide her laughter. What a strange thing to have at a wedding, the page thought. But he didn't dare hesitate any longer, for he knew what the squire's temper was like. So he unhitched the pony and led her back to the squire's house as fast as their little legs could carry them. By this time, the squire and the parson were getting more and more irate. The parson kept pacing up and down, looking at the clock tick-tocking on the wall, and disapprovingly at the guests, who, having indulged freely in food and drink, still noticed how anxious the squire was looking, and began whispering to each other, "Where's the mysterious bride? Maybe she's stood him up at the last minute." heard these whispers and grew even more annoyed. It really wouldn't do for such an important man as he was to be made a fool of by a mere slip of a girl. So when the lad ran in, all breathless and panting, the squire grabbed hold of him and demanded, "Well, did you bring her with you?" "She's standing out by the door," the lad replied. "But don't give me any buts," the squire cried. "Go and take her up to Mother's old room." And he aimed a cuff at the lad's ear. Well, the page could see the squire was in no mood to argue, but how could he possibly lead the pony up the stairs into the room by himself? He asked some of the servants to give him a hand, but when he told them what the squire had demanded, they flatly refused to have anything to do with the matter. The boy, remembering the squire's angry instructions only too vividly, at last managed to persuade the two men to help him. With much difficulty, they managed to get the little pony, who was by now getting very frisky, to trot upstairs, much against her will, and eventually into the bedchamber where all the bride's beautiful clothes were laid out in readiness. The pony was quite unused to such strange treatment, but by dint of heavy persuasion, they managed to make her stay in the room. In the meantime, though, the guests were beginning to enjoy themselves so much that they no longer cared that time was passing. This was not the case with the parson, however. He was scandalized by the day's events. The pony wasn't too happy either. At last, the exhausted page could report to the squire, "Well, master, that's been done, but what an awful job. She's in a dreadful temper now, you know." The squire was so relieved to hear the good news that he just patted the boy on the head and said, "Well, never mind, she'll soon cheer up." Happily, he announced to the guests that the bride would shortly be down to greet them. He told the parson to get his Bible and prayer book ready, as the ceremony would soon take place. "Don't hang around with your mouth open, boy," he ordered the page. "Go and send the women up to dress her." Well, the boy was astounded by this command, but he knew better than to argue with the squire this time. Go on," the squire urged impatiently. "You're keeping the parson and all our guests waiting, not to mention me, and I've had to wait long enough." So the boy had no choice but to run off down to the kitchens where all the servants had gathered to watch the fun and laugh at their master's strange behaviour that day. When they heard the squire's strange command, they almost split their sides. Some thought that the squire was drunk, others that he had gone mad at last, but all agreed that they wouldn't have missed the fun today for anything. So, led by the page and giggling and laughing, a bevy of servant girls hurried along to the bride's bedroom to carry out as best as they could their master's strange command. The little pony, for her part, was making herself as much at home as she could. She had already made a meal of the bride's bouquet. And when the maids saw her and saw all the finery laid out ready to be worn, they couldn't contain themselves. They all agreed the master must be playing a stupendous joke on his guests, and they set to work with a will. Getting a pony dressed in human clothes is not a quiet affair, but the guests were having such a good time downstairs that even when they heard all the clattering and noise upstairs, they simply thought the bride was displaying some high spirits, which only increased still further their curiosity about the identity of the squire's bride. Certainly nobody could have dreamt that the bride had a mane, a tail, and 4 hard hooves. Upstairs, the maids were doing their best to dress the pony, and she was doing her best too. She certainly didn't approve of these strange goings-on, but 4 against 1 must win the day, and eventually and reluctantly she was persuaded to keep the bridal wear on and trot downstairs. What exhausting work it was, but at last the page could announce that the bride was about to appear. The guests craned to get their first glimpse of her. Bang, bang, clatter, the guests heard in astonishment. Bang, bang, as the pony trotted down. And there she was, the squire's bride, suitably arrayed and attended. The guests roared with laughter. They had never seen anything so funny as the little pony dressed in all that bridal finery. Everybody split their sides with mirth, except the squire. He realized that he had been made a fool of. Gretel had taught him a lesson in humility. He vowed there and then that he would never again try and force someone to become the squire's bride.